Good afternoon, good evening, welcome, welcome. My name is Sarah Stefanich, and I'm the implementation manager here at Clet World Languages. We're very happy to have you here with us tonight for Assessments that Empower Learning, a proficiency-based approach. Tonight, we're exploring how to design assessments that truly support language learning, focusing on students' communicative proficiency rather than just isolated skills. You'll leave this webinar with practical strategies you can apply right away in your own classroom. And we're very lucky to be joined by two fantastic presenters. So first, my colleague, Katie Michael, is our implementation specialist here at Clout World Languages. Katie has a strong background in Spanish linguistics and second language acquisition, and she's passionate about engaging learners through real-world tasks and authentic materials. And she's also joined by Sonia Josa Castro, who is the academic coordinator at Texas Tech University's Costa Rica campus. Sonia is also one of the authors of our Reportero series, and she brings years of experience teaching students of all ages across multiple countries. Her areas of expertise include communicative methods, curriculum design, and assessment. And so, Katie and Sonia, the floor is now yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah, for that great introduction. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. It is no small thing to teach a full day if you're in the classroom right now and then log on in the evening to do more learning about how to best support your students. So thank you all for joining us. And without further ado, we'll get started. So our session title for today is Assessments that Empower Learning, a Proficiency-Based Approach. And the objectives that we've kind of set for today's webinar would be first, to reflect about your own assessment practices and kind of as we're going along, ask yourself, what do I already do and what can I do next? And then second, we'll understand the what, the why, and the how of proficiency-based assessment. So to achieve those objectives, we're going to organize this session today into the following areas: understanding proficiency-based assessment, principles of proficiency-based assessment, how to implement these types of assessments, some challenges and takeaways, and then end with our Q&A time. So to kick us off, we want to know what your comfort level is with this type of assessment. So how would you describe your current familiarity with proficiency-based assessment on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being brand new to you? So maybe you've never used proficiency-based assessment, you're not really sure what they entail, and 5 being, I know all about them. I've used them with my students and I'm here to get some affirmation that I'm on the right track, or maybe just see if there's something I haven't considered. So you can put this in the chat so we can see. I know there's a lot of you here, and let's just see where we stand as a group before we dive in to the topic for tonight. Seeing lots of 3s, that's great. So maybe you've kind of dabbled in it or you've used them here and there. Yeah, awesome. Some 5s, excellent. And some 1s too. So that's great. A range, which is what we would expect. So hopefully no matter where you fell in the range tonight, there's something that you can take away from this session and apply to your teaching. So we'll get right into the first part by unpacking a little bit about what we mean by proficiency-based assessment. So if you've been with us for this webinar series that we've hosted this spring, all about proficiency-oriented teaching, then you've got the foundations under your belt already. And if not, then I invite you to go back and watch those. You can find them on our YouTube channel to get more general basics about teaching for proficiency. So we go over the foundations, kind of the why and how with grammar and vocabulary when you're teaching for proficiency. So we're focusing today on the assessment part of proficiency-oriented teaching. Kind of this big question about how do we make sure we can incorporate assessments that support students in progressing down their path of proficiency development. So first, we want to establish what it is that we're measuring. We are calling these proficiency-based assessments because we aren't actually assessing proficiency in the classroom. And this distinction is super important. Proficiency can be understood as how well students use the language in the real world, in unrehearsed scenarios and unfamiliar context to them. And then performance, on the other hand, is how they use language that they've learned and practiced in an instructional setting on familiar tasks, so about familiar topics. And ACTFL's guidelines go in depth on the difference between these two with illustrations. So if you want more information on that, definitely seek out the actual proficiency guidelines for more information. But we wanted to clarify that for this session today, that true proficiency assessments are not really designed with the classroom context in mind. So one example you can think of is the oral proficiency interview. The OPI is administered by specialists that are trained on proficiency with an expert knowledge of the guidelines and the performance indicators by level. So we're not evaluating true proficiency in our classroom setting. As classroom language teachers, we actually measure and assess performance, but using the guidelines and our communicative goals to shape the assessment, as well as some principles that we're going to get into next, we can be measuring performance, but still with an eye toward proficiency. And if you're familiar with the book Common Ground by Florencia Henshaw and Maris Hawkins, they describe this as proficiency through performance, which is kind of a good way to think about it. So when we refer in this session to a performance assessment, that's another term for a proficiency-based assessment. And what do we mean by proficiency-based exactly? So let's kind of take a step back and look at how assessments have evolved with proficiency-oriented instruction. Traditionally, what was taught in language classes each day, you might be familiar with this, was kind of organized around a grammar or vocab point. Like on Wednesday, we're doing reflexive verbs, etc. So assessments in the world language classroom were kind of much the same way. They lacked a meaningful context. They centered on discrete grammatical structures and vocabulary. Thinking like, okay, in this unit, I taught XYZ structures and vocabulary, so that's what I'll make an exam for XYZ grammar structures. And then over time, instruction became more communicative. And as we're language teachers in the classroom, we've begun to prioritize the use of language for communicative purposes in our instructional approach. And I'm guessing that that's where most of you are, or where you want to be, because you're here in a series on proficiency-oriented teaching. And so assessment has kind of slowly begun to catch up with those evolving classroom practices and to connect to instruction, which should be the case. With performative assessments, that's the idea. They're centered on proficiency goals and the communicative outcomes that learners can accomplish. And this is kind of a nice description of proficiency-based or performance assessments. Performance assessments motivate learners to show what they know and can do, unlike more traditional assessments that focus on recall of grammatical structures and vocabulary in a contextual vacuum. So totally decontextualized, unrelated to a greater purpose, and don't really show us at all how to use language. It's just a test for language knowledge. However, going back to this visual for a moment, in that shift from traditional to proficiency-based assessment, there was, and often still is, a mismatch between instruction and assessment. So even as we're doing communicative activities in class, our assessment still ends up being traditional in nature. And the assessments are still mostly mechanical drills, matching, fill in the blank with the correct conjugation, so things that are more discrete knowledge of grammatical structures. Assessment practices are still catching up. We've got them in place. We've got some great, and we'll look at that in a second when we look at types of performance assessments. We know what they are, but still there's a lag in actually incorporating these into our departments, into our courses. And why does that matter? Why is this significant? Why should we be embracing proficiency-based assessments? Bill Van Patten, in his book, While We're on the Topic, has a great quote about this, and I'll read it. It's there on the screen. The goals of communicative, proficiency-oriented curricula are not the goals of traditional tests. And this is the key point. If our goal is true communication, then we have to rethink our assessments too to mirror those goals. So thinking backward design here. If in our instructional practices, we're setting goals that are based on meaningful communication, then we need to use an assessment that shows us if students achieved those specified goals. A communicative classroom needs a communicative assessment, or to put another way, if we teach communicatively, test communicatively. And similarly, as we've been talking about this throughout the webinar series, we need to embrace that proficiency-oriented mindset. So if we want our students to be able to grow their proficiency, and we're focused on that during instructional time, which is amazing, then in our assessments, we need to give students that same chance to show us that they can use language, not just tell us what they know about language. So how concretely can we do that? How can we make an assessment where students are showing us what they know? Let's get into what these types of assessments consist of, the principles of proficiency-based assessment. Here are some guiding principles, and we've already alluded to many of these points. So when we think about proficiency-based or performance assessments, they should be communication focused, meaning real-world language use rather than isolated skills, thinking about incorporating three modes of communication, contextualized and meaningful. Tasks should be situated in relevant scenarios, authentic when you can, performance-based, involve students using their knowledge and skills to perform a task. They should include descriptive feedback over scores. So the focus here is more on qualitative feedback using things like rubrics, the can-do statements that you can really use to guide learning and give more information about the student's results. Should be growth-oriented, encourage risk-taking, self-reflection on the part of the student, and show progress over time instead of just correctness there on that one task. And lastly, they should reflect instructional experiences in which learners have engaged. Yes, this is related to what we said before about a communicative classroom needs a communicative assessment, but it's more than that. With this point too, we want to remember that we want to set students up for success to show us what they know. So now is not the time to throw curveballs in there and try to stump our students or include language that you haven't practiced, they haven't seen before in class, tasks that you know they're not quite ready for, but you want to give them that challenge. There is a place to challenge, but we also want it to be possible for all of our learners to do well on the assessment. So keep kind of thinking about these principles as we go along to keep in mind. So with those in mind, there are many types of proficiency-based assessments, and this goes for formative and summative. Both can be aligned with a proficiency-based approach. A few examples could be tasks. Like we've talked about when we mention tasks, we're referring to a communicative activity with a clear goal that mirrors real world language use. Role plays, projects and presentations, which is related to a task, but maybe a little bit larger and more complex, maybe more of a longer term thing, especially as we talk about projects. And then integrated performance assessments are known as kind of the gold standard for proficiency-based assessments. And we'll look more closely with those later when Sonia does her piece. But regardless of the type of assessment you're using, a typical format for a proficiency-based assessment would be learner is presented with a prompt or a situation, and then they use the knowledge and skills in the target language that they need and that they have available to address that question or situation using any combination of the three modes of communication that you would determine for that task. So that's kind of the minimum what you need to make something that's a proficiency-oriented or proficiency-based assessment. This seems straightforward, but it's easy to fall back into traditional grading habits. So let's illustrate this with two examples. We're going to look at two different assessments here where the principles we talked about are and are not incorporated so well. So here's an example activity or an example assessment from an intermediate level Spanish course. And I'll just read the gist quickly. I know it's kind of small on the screen. The instructions say, write a letter to your mayor about the environment, the pollution in your town, and what should be done to make the situation better. Be sure to include expressions with the subjunctive and to state what may happen if we don't do anything to stop it, as well as your feelings about the current situation and hopes for a better future. If you're a Spanish teacher there, you know what this is trying to get the students to use. And it says use at least 3 expressions and words from the word bank below. Use subjunctive and indicative. At first glance, maybe this seems okay. You're like, it's a presentational writing assessment. We're giving the students a chance to put their language skills to use. They're creating something, they're writing a letter. There's some limited context there, a bit of a shallow contextualization, but it's there. But the biggest issue is that the goal and purpose of this is clearly to see if learners can accurately use the subjunctive and the indicative, both conjugate them correctly and use them in the correct contexts. And then we also want to see how many new vocabulary words they remember and can throw in there and use. So this is actually still a drill-based assessment, really, just disguised in the form of a writing task. It's focusing heavily on learners using specific forms and words. It even dictates the number of words they have to use. There's a word limit. So we want to see how much can they write. And this kind of like bounding can really backfire because it restricts what the student is able to write. And that makes it harder for them a lot of times to actually use their skills to communicate. We're almost stopping them before they get started in a way. So students are aware of how their grade's going to be determined here. As you can see at the end, there's the point value saying how many points for vocab and how many points for grammar. So overall, this task is really communicating two main things to learners. One, I care less about what you write and more about how you write it. And two, accuracy is the most important aspect of communication. So we could say that there are some good intentions here, and there are, and it's probably a step above, a traditional test with isolated sentences and no context at all. But this isn't really a strong example of a truly proficiency-based task, even if it's targeting, using the presentational mode of communication. So this is a trap we can easily fall into. And so let's look now at how we could escape the trap with a better example. So what could it look like to reframe this task into a presentational performance assessment? This project is one example. This comes from the third level in our Reporteros series, which is geared for intermediate learners too. Very similar. In this project, we see the context laid out first. It says, it's Earth Day, and the school magazine has asked its readers to write an open letter to their community in different languages and ask for improvements to the town. So this context is a bit more real world and relevant. The school newspaper, Earth Day, it's something you might talk about with your students in class. And then the students do a brainstorm about environmental problems where they live and possible solutions, and pick one of those problems to write about. They have time to brainstorm about a real problem that exists in their town versus forcing them to come up with some pretend problem that aligns with the chapter vocabulary if they need to use the word extinct because they learned about, extinction. So they're guided then with some ideas of generally what to mention in the letter, but there's no exact language that they have to use here. No explicit mention of the need to use the subjunctive to make requests, even though that's part of what is covered in this chapter. No specific vocabulary students have to incorporate, no word count to meet, no points for grammar and vocabulary indicated up front, but a holistic rubric is used instead to evaluate this. So one important difference that we see here, which makes this more communicative, is that the prompt is written in a way to naturally elicit that language, but the primary focus is on meaning and communication. This is where your students get to show you what they can do with all that they've been learning and using already in the chapter. This is a rather small but profound change that has a big impact in terms of the results, in terms of being more proficiency centered, and in terms of what we're communicating to students about what matters. So in this next section, we're going to look more closely at a few more concrete examples, so I'm not going to get too bogged down here, but this serves as a good contrast maybe with what we just saw, so you can kind of get your wheels turning and thinking about how to shift assessment practices toward a more proficiency-oriented approach. So with all of that in mind, I'll switch over to Sonia now that we have a clear understanding of what performance assessments are. So Sonia, take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Let me see if I can share my screen. There you go. Can you guys see it? Thumbs up.
We can see it.
Good. So thanks for having me today. I'm very excited. And in this second part of the webinar, we are going to focus on two things: designing assessments and developing the rubrics that go with them. So these two topics can have their own 2-hour webinar so because it's a lot to process, but in this bit that we have here, so we will I hope to give you like some hints on how to start or what to do, and then we're going to touch base on different things. So let's start designing our proficiency-based assessments. What do we need to take into account? There are a couple of things. First of all, our school context. Where do we teach? What is what is it a school or a district that goes through more through the traditional way, or is more skill centered? How does the school teach math? How does the school teach ELA? Do they use rubrics in others? How can I work as a whole school? And we'll see that it's gonna be coming up as we go through the different points. Also, what grades do we teach? The way that we present the projects or the assessments, the way that we present the rubrics is different if you are teaching elementary, middle school, high school, or higher education, right? Depending on the developmental age of our students, we can twist different things. Summative and formative, as Katie already mentioned, formative can totally be proficiency-based assessment as well as summative. I think that many times we encourage we do a lot of summative, more proficiency-based, but also formative can be. So we'll have some examples of that. An incredible important point: time. What's the time that we have to do the assessment? Does the school tell us that my students need to have a final exam that is going to be 3 hours long? What flexibility do I have? How can I organize it? Or I can do a proficiency-based assessment that is going to be done in multiple classes. It doesn't need to be done in one specific day. So how can I play with that to be successful? And also students' differentiation needs. And two things come into my mind in this aspect. First, their learning needs. What am I going to include in the instructions and in the rubrics if some of my students have a learning profile? Am I going to put more information there or less information? How can I help them? And also the language proficiency needs. So if I have a multi-level class with different students, maybe we can all kind of talk about the same topic, but I am adapting the project and the content of the project, the requirements that I'm asking the students to do for the assessment to their language level. And then also like the rubric that I'm using is going to be adapted to the students' needs. Then we know that's the main goal in any proficiency-based assessment, is that the students show their communication skills. And there are different kinds of assessment. Katie mentioned some, and I wanted to actually focus on two today, and also talk about a little bit about a third one. So the assessments we are going to see today are first the task-based learning, and mostly focus on projects, as well as the IPAs, the integrated performance assessments, which are based on the ACFL World Readiness Standards. And then one that I kind of assessment, I don't know if it's an assessment, but that I have always in my toolbox is what I call for today's webinar, YATA, which is an inspiring activities turned into assessments. That's like you are using a textbook that it's proficiency based and you are not getting to the final project yet, but there's this activity that can inspire a formative project, a formative assessment, or a summative assessment. And so let's look for those kind of activities as well. Let's start with the task-based learning and projects, just very fast, their characteristics: assess the use of language in a real world and authentic situation. They incorporate a lot of the 21st century skills, right? There's communication among the students. There's collaboration if it's in a group. There's creativity because the students need to present their project in a creative way, and critical thinking, right? We have the students brainstorming. We ask them questions so that they can improve their project and solve that problem that they've had. It implies, usually projects implies language rehearsal. For example, my personal foreign language project has been to get ready for this presentation, right? So I've had to practice. I rehearse what I'm going to say in each slide, what words am I going to use. And so projects come usually with this language rehearsal. Usually they use, when you do a project, multiple modes of communication are used. Again, to my personal project here, I had to read in English for some looking for information. I had to write my slides in English, and then now I am speaking to you. That's kind of like the final project, right? So there are multiple steps involved, but there's usually one mode of communication that stands out, and that's usually the one that we end up assessing. And also in projects, usually feedback comes throughout the project, right? Like imagine your students are working in groups or individual projects, and you just go right from group to group and students and checking in, see how they're doing, answering questions, giving feedback. Even if you see that some students are struggling with some grammar points, like, okay, class, remember, and giving them advice. And then there's a deadline, and then that's what they need to present. And for this, the task-based learning projects and kinds of assessments, usually we use a rubric or a checklist, and I'm going to get more into the more detail later on. So this here, for example, this is part of Reporteros 2. It's Unit 1, and we have the objectives. These are our learning objectives for the unit. This one is about the neighborhood. And so there are different things that we are going to assess in this unit, right? We are going to talk about describing the neighborhoods, locate places, transportation, sustainability, propose, accept, and turn down plans. And we're going to do this by using this grammar and vocabulary about the city and transportation. And also we will learn about different neighborhoods in Madrid. We are going to talk about the European Mobility Week. So that's how our unit looks like. In a more traditional way, we might do that in the summative assessment or the formative assessment. We do activities with filling the gaps for the grammar, or we ask the students to match pictures with the vocabulary, or then we just, for the final exam, one of the questions is describe your neighborhood, or there's a picture of a neighborhood and we tell them describe this neighborhood. Or for the speaking, we can ask them like, okay, tell me what you know about the European Mobility Week after we have talked about it in class. So all these are great activities for the students to learn, to practice, and to develop their skills. However, they are not as proficiency based. How can we do that? So showing the project. So what do we need first? The characteristics, and Katie mentioned some of them. We need a context. In this case, the context is that the students are part of a neighborhood group that decided to create an informative guide for new people that move into their neighborhood. And this is Spanish class. So, and those are newcomers that are Spanish speakers. So this is your context, and it's a real context. I don't know if 12 or 13-year-olds do belong to, in their neighborhood and to groups that do that. Some might not be interested at all, but it's a total real situation, and it can inspire these 12, 13-year-olds to do and be part of their own community with these ideas, right? So we tell them what the product is. In this case, this is a digital informational guide, and we tell them what to do. Well, not to do, but like we give them ideas. And the first step is to brainstorm, right? Here, for example, we do propose things that they can include. So Katie mentioned before that students should brainstorm this, and we don't need that guidance. And I totally agree. This can be introduced without showing these pages and let students brainstorm either as a whole class or in groups. Also, it's important though that, for example, if they are middle school students or ninth graders, so that's when the age of our students come into place and how they have been trained to do this critical thinking. So if you've been working on it for a long time, it's going to be easier for them to get the ideas going. But especially maybe at the beginning, if they don't know much about it or how to train this skill, they do need your help, right? So also we can add or delete this kind of information and let students choose where they go. One thing that they can also do, right? You've been working on a whole unit about this topic, so they have them fresh. And because, as also Katie mentioned, we are in a classroom context, right? We've spent time learning certain things. We kind of, at the end of the day, need to tell the students, remember, you need to show me as much as you can. You need to impress me. I always tell that to the students, impress me. You know what we are like all the words that we've been learning. Impress me by knowing how to work cognates. Impress me by using new words that have come to the classroom, like have come up in the classroom, but not often. But you got that word and you remember it. You have studied it. So it's a matter of impressing me, because at the end of the day, I'm in the classroom with you. I need to give you a grade and a report card, right? So anyway, we can adapt and give them more or less guidance. But another thing that I also wanted to mention is the last point, which is how to share this project. We can share the projects in the classroom, right? If they do a website about the neighborhood, they can all look at each other's website and leave it like that. However, how can I make that this project it's outside of the classroom? Maybe if the school has a newsletter and sometimes they put information about what's happening in the school, make sure that you as a teacher tell the person in charge of the newsletter to put samples of the website that your students have created. Or even if you want to take it a step farther, why not check in the neighborhoods? Encourage the students to do that. It's like, do you think this would be useful in your neighborhood? This would be a need. Why don't we email someone, an organization, a public organization, a private organization that might benefit, that helps newcomers to the neighborhood, and see if they would be interested to put that and as a real material for the people that come. And that is what becomes also like this motivation that Katie mentioned, that it's like getting to the proficiency. It's motivation to get to that proficiency as well. So next to the next kind of assessment, we are going to talk about the IPAs, Integrated Performance Assessment, and their characteristics as the projects is to assess the use of a language in the real world. They do require authentic materials. And a difference with the projects is that IPAs are more for spontaneous and non-rehearsed assessment. So that is like it happens in the classroom. The students, I'm gonna show you an example and you're gonna see what I mean. But it just, you don't need to rehearse for these kind of assessments, right? It's more spontaneous. Also, the IPAs really assess three modes of communication that are interconnected. So we always start with an interpretive assessment, which can be reading, interpretive viewing, or interpretive listening. From that assessment, students can have an interpersonal assessment that is totally related with what we learned in the first interpretive activity. And maybe then we can have a presentational one, which helps after I've done the interpretive, I've done the interpersonal, and then I do a presentational, and they are all interconnected. I'm going to show you in a minute. And a difference also from Yes, and no difference. Feedback usually, and with the IPAs, is after each mode of communication. So first we do the interpretive, and we give feedback to the students. Then they do the interpersonal, we give feedback, and the presentational, and we give feedback. So let me show you an example. I think you can see it, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, this is an IPA of the same unit that we saw with the project about the neighborhood. And so the most important thing of IPAs is the context. So I'm going to read it to you, but the context in this assessment is you are very excited because next month you will be learning Spanish in Buenos Aires, Argentina, while living with a host family. You have already exchanged some emails with the agency that is helping you through the process, and they ask you about where you would like to live. First, you will read information from an Argentinian website that the agency sent. Then you will talk to another student who is also going to Buenos Aires about the information. Finally, you will write to the agency explaining your neighborhood preferences. That's what the student is going to do. And that's the context. It is also very real context, right? So they start interpretive reading. So we have an article that is from authentic material. It's from Revista Digital Buena Vibra. And then we create for the interpretive task, it could also be a video, it could be an audio, but we always create activities. The most important activity to always start to is the main idea. When we read this, can you tell me what's the purpose of the article, video, audio that you read or listened to? Why and how do you know that, right? Because when we read, that's what we get, the main idea. Then we can ask about guessing some new words that we haven't seen, that they did not appear in our unit. Can you guess by the context what they mean? Then we can check on the supporting details, not the main idea, but we can ask them more specific comprehension questions. And finally, I have to say, this is my favorite, is the personal connection. When you are reading that, like trigger, like with a question, how can you connect with the text that you just read? For example, think about a neighborhood in your city or a different city, that is similar to one of the neighborhoods in the article. Describe it and explain what's interesting. So once they've done, like by explaining this, they need to prove that they have understood the text. So after this, we have the rubric and we check their comprehension, the interpretive reading. Bear in mind that we are focusing here on interpretive reading in this case. Even if they have written in Spanish, if we downgrade their paragraph. We grade what they mean and if they have understood the text. Then after we've given them the feedback, we go to the interpersonal speaking activity in this case, which is in pairs, exchange your opinions about the different neighborhoods and reflect on the neighborhood you would like to live. Same thing. So students here can record an audio, can have the conversation in front of you while your other students are working on a formative or something else. Or, they can record a video and then you see it later. But the important thing is here, there's no rehearsal at all. So you just put two people together, like you two are going to work on this part. So that's the difference from the project, and this more spontaneous part. And then after this, after they've read, after they've talked about someone else about the projects, that's when they email this agency telling them where they would like to live, why, and asking some questions. Here, if we think that the student, because of their learning profile, needs some ideas on what to ask, we can add them as well. We can always modify assessment based on our students' need. And we give them then the rubric with the presentational. So in the ideal world of the IPAs, this is supposed to happen, right? As I mentioned, reading, give feedback, which means assessing, we assess, then speaking, listen to the audio or the interview and giving them the assessment, and finally reading assessing the text that they wrote and giving them the feedback. I have never been able to do this in class, never. So usually with IPAs, I do make them in different days. However, I have not been able to grade all of them and have them ready for the next day so that they can do it again. So I think that that's when we need to adapt the time and our context and what we can do, right? So this can also be something that maybe if the students have to sit down for a 3-hour exam, maybe that's what we do. And the speaking part, well, it's part of this exam. It's part of what we do. And we just put them into pairs in the exam session and they just talk to each other. So that is one of the examples of the IPAs. I think I'm back to the presentation. So this is very fast. One example of one of these inspiring activities turned into assessments. So this is a part of Reporteros 1, and it's at the end of each unit, this article that the Reporteros write, and there's about different, it's more like cultural things. This one is an article about Arturo Schomburg, and it has an activity that let's see here. So they do need to do, the students, it suggests that the student does some research about other Afro-Latinos, and it's Reporteros 1, I think it's Novice Low, yeah, Novice Low, it's one of the first units, and they just write the main information about their Afro-Latino that they wanted to research. So that's one activity that it was there. And my students really got engaged with this and start talking about activism. And then I figured it's like, well, this is not the final project. This is not the IPA, but this can totally be our summative assessment. So we ended up doing it as a summative assessment. Students chose an activist that they wanted of any country they wanted. I wanted to make that motivation, and we learned extra. It wasn't in the unit, but we learned vocabulary about activism. And then they just did the research and write and make posters. And one thing that I thought about is like, well, maybe there are other classes that can be engaged in this. So I just emailed my students' teachers, and it turns out that in English, they were also talking about activism. And then this happened when I was working at the international school in Lithuania. And the Lithuanian teacher said that she would love to, because she was also doing personal information with her students. So it turned out into this wall of Lithuanian written posters and Spanish written posters in an English-speaking school with different activists that the students chose. And we also had a blank one where people could write what activists they admire or something like that. So that's what I meant. That's something like sometimes just by looking, if we use proficiency-based materials, we can get ideas that are not the projects or the IPAs. Okay. Then this became a summative assessment, but it could also be a formative assessment. To do formative assessments, I think it's very important that we just choose one relevant topic, and it can be the unit topic, something that is on the news, a school topic, and then we prepare an assessment that can be done in one class or less than one class. And all then can be proficiency-based. Some examples, we can have a text and then we do a quick poll, or they watch a video and then we do a quick poll. We can do activities like think, pair, and share, where you put a question, students reflect on it, share with the student, talk about it in a partner or in groups, and then they share like for 1 minute, share what your group thought about this. This is totally proficiency-based. Research, do some research about a topic, and the same, think in a group and share it. Also put a question out there, and you say you have 1 minute or 5 or 10 to write a paper about this, right? And it's just writing. keep journal entries, like every Monday or every Friday. They keep a notebook in the classroom where they write in Spanish about one question that matches their language level. Concept maps, classroom discussions, cartoon movies, all these are also activities that can happen while, I don't know, like you're doing an interview to the student to check their interpersonal skills, and the students can be working on a concept map, and that counts as a formative assessment. Also, classroom discussions. If there's a lot of speaking in the classroom, you observe, and maybe every 2 weeks you give the students a rubric with, look, that's what I'm observing from our classroom discussions, like overall, right? So there are ways that we can also assess with proficiency based. So now we are going to get into the rubrics and how to design and develop the rubrics. Again, this could be a 2-hour workshop, so we're going to be a little bit fast, and if you have any questions, we'll have time at the end. But why do we need rubrics? Why is that? Well, communication is made out of multiple pieces of language, right? So this way we can give very, very specific information about all these multiple pieces. And it helps the student to clarify what is expected from them. If it's important that the student, before they are being assessed, before they do a project, before they do an IPA, before they do a formative assessment, what are they going to be assessed? What are we looking for? So if we show the students before, and we start doing this in middle school, right? Like what their level that they have, if it's novice, but they know exactly what we are looking for. By the time the students are taking like foreign language classes in 11th grade or 12th grade, 10th grade, they already know what it is expected from them, right? It helps for the language differentiation of the different levels. The level changes, right? But what we are looking for, it doesn't change. I'm looking for fluency. I'm still looking for words that we are learned. So it helps the student know where they are. Also, they are useful to inform not only the students of where they are, but also the parents. For me, it's very important that rubrics are in English, because the students then don't need to think about how to say that in Spanish or what does it really mean. It's in English. It's in in the language that they understand, and parents as well, right? Because I don't know if you've ever done conference with parents with a rubric in front of you of how their child is doing, but it's the easiest conferences that you're going to have, because the parents see it right away, what's expected, and where their child is. And also, I think it's very useful for report cards, because if you need to write report cards, if you need to write comments, you look at the rubrics of the student and you see exactly the strengths and the weaknesses, and it's very easy to write a comment for them, or to just note like, hey, you're doing great, you're learning all the vocab, but let's work more on the grammar part, let's work more on the text organization. So it gives you a clear idea. So overall, rubrics really facilitate, I think, the teacher's life. Let me show you one example. So this is the same project about the neighborhood, and here is the rubric. This rubric has 2 parts. One is optional, the other one is essential. The optional part for me is the content checklist. I like to do content checklists for those students that really need a checklist, and especially at the beginning of the school year, so that the students get used on what I'm really looking for when they do an assessment, right? So they can have the communication goals, and we can be as specific as we want with the language ones. So in a way, we are training the students to as I said before, impress us when they write and to communicate. And especially in higher levels of the language, if we've been learning about the subjunctive, but you write a whole essay without any subjunctives because you can communicate without subjunctive, but that is not the point, right? So it's like you need to show the maximum level that you can show me. So these can totally be adapted of where our students are when we do the assessment. And maybe some students have their learning profile where they do require a checklist, and even more specific checklist than this, because they need a list of vocabulary, right? So we can put it in this part of the rubric. And then we do have the uh, communication rubric. So there's the project, then this is the communication part. We also have an intercultural communication and the product presentation. So how does it work? These are, for example, like these are the little multiple pieces that I was talking about before, right? Here we have the exceeds, the meets, and approaches expectations. So does that work? For me, meets expectations is that after what we have learned in class, I want to see this according to your level. This is novice. So according to your level, I want to see a variety of familiar words that we have learned, as well as some new words and words that you have learned in the past. That's based on actual description. I want to see most of the words that are spelled correctly. I want to see that you use practice language structures. There are some errors, but I still can understand. It doesn't affect communication. And I can see that there's an attempt that you want to create with the language. I also want to see that most of the message is totally communicated, that the text is well organized. There may be some punctuation errors, and that the text is comprehensible. This is my expectation. Anything that falls back, it's the approaches. You don't use as many new words. You have too many errors that imply that I can understand, that would be approaches. While exceeds is like kind of like, if this is novice, I think it's reportero dos in this case, so it's hints of intermediate level. But for example, not intermediate level in grammar, for example, because if you tell students, I want you to do something that we haven't learned before, if and that's exceeding, is like, then it's when they start using Google Translate. No, I want accuracy, right? I want that your grammar is perfect. That is exceeding. I want that you use a wide variety of words. All the words are spelled correctly. The message is fully communicated, and it's very clearly organized, the text that you wrote. So that's what I am looking for. That sometimes we are working like exceeds, meets, and approaches. It's these criteria, these descriptors are not always the case. And what we can do is to adapt these kind of rubrics to what our school dictates. For example, if I taught at a school, I hope you can see this. I taught at a school where they use letter grading, right? I've taught at schools that use exceeds, meets, and approaches. Others use letter grading. So I went from 3 descriptors to 5. So what did I do? It's kind of, I stretch the approaches part. Okay, for me, B plus, B minus, like the B range is the secure. You've got this. It's the meets. The A is excellent. You have exceeded. So this kind of like stay the same. And then what do we have? Like developing. Okay, the message is partially communicated. Mostly uses familiar words, but very few new words. Or the D is beginning. You're beginning, but you are definitely not there. The written message is minimally communicated. And you don't use that many words. But what can happen? Can happen that one student is here and the secure area for communication. It's maybe in the developing for vocab, and but grammar is pretty good. So we need to check each box, right? The text is super well organized, right? You did well, and it's comprehensible. Okay, so imagine we have this. So we can tell a student, uh, looking at all the areas, where would it be? Okay, you are a B, you are secure. However, maybe there's so many mistakes that we cannot really understand anything, right? So, okay, that makes you're on B for secure, but your grammar is not good enough. You have an F. So we need to play with it. I also know that some people give percentages on each category, and that I think it depends a lot on your team, on what works with the school. And that's when we talk to what do the math teachers do, what does ELA do, because I think it's important for the students to have the good combo for all. So yeah, adapting what the rubrics or what we need is really important. And those couple of slides are things that I just mentioned, so that you have them from when we share them. And I think we are ready for the challenges and takeaways. Katie, would you like to start?
Okay, yes, let me get it ready. Sonia, don't unshare yet, just in case.
Okay.
Let's see. All right. Are you seeing this? Sonia, can you give me a verbal yes if I'm...
Let me see. I'm going to stop
Yep, I
sharing.
think I've got it. Okay, good. Someone gave me a thumbs up. Great.
Okay,
Okay,
good.
so, yeah, we'll get into the challenges and takeaways now. So we'll wrap up with this. So remember to make engaging assessments. Use real situations, real materials to make the assessments more fun for the students and more relevant and useful to them. So try to connect your performance tasks to the real world as much as you can, knowing that we are in a classroom. We can't not be in the classroom setting. We know that. But try to make it as real world as you can. And then we recognize that you might be limited in what you can actually do at your local institution. But remember with these, it's not an all or nothing. It's not, I have to do the IPA exactly as it is with the interpretive first, then feedback, then that's an ideal scenario. But as Sonia said herself, she's not been able to do them that way. So don't feel like you can't get started at all if you can't do it full tilt. So you can adapt these to your reality of space, time, rules, customize it to your setting, within what's within your control, I should say. As long as you keep those principles of proficiency-based assessment, there is a lot of ways you can start to make little shifts and sprinkle these in where you can. So one idea, they can be time consuming. If you're able to have students do projects in groups, that can really help. Then you don't have individual projects to grade and have to factor in the time for them to present if there's a presentation piece. Usually there is. So if you can do groups, try groups. And if IPAs are meant to take a few days, but you only have one day that you're allotted for assessment, is it possible that you could borrow 2 class days, for doing those first 2 parts of the IPA and then leave the assessment day for that presentational mode? Is it possible that students could do the interpretive part at home? I mean, think about what's within what you're able to do. And then both those things would still be proficiency aligned, just less grading pressure at once. Leverage your formative assessments, and Sonia had some great examples of formatives you can use. These can still be proficiency based, so use those quick formative tasks if that's possible where you teach, and let that be where you start incorporating more proficiency based assessment. And then you can also try like turning everyday class activities into informal assessments, like collecting samples occasionally of what your students produce. If they wrote something, a couple sentences based on some communicative task you did in class that was meaningful and contextualized, and you just collect those and give them some feedback. That also is one way you can begin to just let them see what that feels like to be assessed in that way. And then this third point about elevated number of students, Sonia, do you want to speak to that a little bit? That point there, if you've got a large class, how to organize doing these assessments?
Yeah, it's, I think it's important to just give them uh, another task to do, right? But that it's a good task. It's a motivational task. The one that really works wonderfully for me is the choose your favorite cartoon, and that you love to watch when you were little. Look for the Spanish version, and then they have like the main idea, the new words and characters questions that it's general, right? So explain what is the episode about, the describe the characters, right? And write down new words that you figure out. So these kind of assessments can work very well and have the students motivated. They're proficiency based while you help or you are assessing other students.
Yeah. That's great. Good tips for someone who's used this in the classroom recently. So, and then another challenge and it's just kind of tip to take away is to rethink error correction. This can be hard for us, but with these assessments, we want to shift our focus to what students can do versus looking at where they fall short. Think about celebrating their progress and resist the urge to correct everything. Try to give feedback about what's within what they've been taught and mistakes that are on par with their level, like what's expected for them to produce. If they're making a mistake in something else because they're trying, then we don't necessarily need to mark that up or give them back something that's got just a bunch of wrong, wrong, wrong all over it. But think celebrating, wow, look at all of this that you did right. And rubrics can really help with that too. An assessment's job, like we said, isn't to stump our students. If we value communication and growth over perfection, let's show our students that we really mean that when we assess. And then Sonia said this many times throughout the session tonight, but again, kind of train your students, that idea to practice throughout the year before the assessment, definitely leading up to it and saying like, I want to see what you can do. Don't just fall back on, your comfortable place. I saw in the chat, someone mentioned like, yeah, but if we don't give them some like prompts with new words, then they'll just use the basic stuff. And that's true, they might, but it can be our role as the teacher to let them know that we want to see what they can do. Sometimes it's just that feeling like someone believes in you and you can do it. So just making sure we always tell them, like Sonia said, impress me.
Yeah. So if I can jump in, I just want to share a student wrote beautifully for his level, did not use a single word of the unit we were talking about. He was able to communicate proficiently, but without the words that we're learning. Why? He didn't study, and that was like, well, you are approaching because I love this. I gave him the rubric. Look at this. This is fantastic. But you are not getting to the higher grade because you're not using the words that we have been learning. But the fact he was using cognates, he was like he put all the tricks of TION words and transform them in, I mean, it was amazing. However, right? So it's like training them, and it takes time. It is true. But if that's the philosophy that you teach every day and you approach the class every day, they'll get to see it and be trained with it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for jumping in. And then lastly, small changes can have a big impact. So just remember that. Maybe you start by using a rubric period. Maybe you've been kind of grading writing by deducting grammar as its own topic. And maybe you just start by saying, I'll start using more rubrics. And that could be your small change. Or you focus on one mode of communication like we talked about before and sprinkle that into your assessment, toolkit. Maybe you aim for one IPA that year. Don't try to get this into every unit. Start with where you are, pick one class, one task, one unit, just keep it manageable. With that in mind, we are gonna get back to those questions that we answered a second ago. So thinking about assessment, what do you already do? And then kind of the takeaway for all of you, choose one thing you'd like to do at the end of this year if you feel ready, or next year when you've got time to prepare something. And then this brings us to the end of our presentation. All the examples you saw tonight came from Reporteros, which is the Spanish program of our Reporters series. which is available for French and German as well, and Italian coming in 2026. So thank you all again for being here with us.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your time this evening, and for your attention and for your questions and for your comments. And a big thank you to Katie and to Sonia for such a practical presentation. I think you've given all of us a lot to think about and a lot of ideas that we can kind of use and think about as we're wrapping up our school years here. So just a reminder to everybody, I'll put the links again real quick if you need them. If you're interested in looking at the materials, this is this first link here. That you can do. And then if you have 30 seconds, 60 seconds to fill out our feedback survey, that would be excellent. Let us know how this webinar was, what you enjoyed, and what you would like to see in future webinars. And then also feel free to check out our webpage on professional development and professional learning opportunities. Katie and I are both on our implementation team, and we love meeting and working with teachers and kind of doing deep dives into IPAs and grading and rubrics and all those things like that. So thank you everybody again for being here with us tonight, and we hope to see you at a future session. And everybody, you can enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll post last link once more, the link to get the certificate of attendance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.